咱要安怎建立台湾人的信心吼？我想我无需要讲伤多，咱即马用上热烈的掌声来甲欢迎。
I'm very honored and overwhelmed a little bit, honestly, to be here speaking today. When I first received the invitation to come talk, I told my wife, and she said, "Did they make a mistake? Why did they?" And I said, "I don't know, but I'm here, so I'll do my best."
接着邀请的是伊问伊太太讲，是毋是请唔着人啊？还是伊足欢喜踮咧食？
So I'd like to thank the host of the conference, and I won't go through name by name to save some time, but I'd like to thank everybody for being here, and I think this is a very, very exciting conference and a great thing to talk about. I'm going to talk about a number of different things today, but I want to start by saying that this is a very important time in Taiwan. We're looking at a crucial point in Taiwan's very young democratic history, and I think the biggest problem we see, we're at a point where the voice, the dominant voice of Taiwan's government is not in tune with the voice of the people that elected it. I think this is a point where the government is speaking in terms that conflict with the beliefs and the values of the people. And a time when the ruling party is promoting an identity and an ideology that is not in line with the majority voice. And finally, a time when the government is implementing policy that does not resonate, does not agree with the majority of people in Taiwan.
伊讲，假如讲几项代志，但是其中上重要的代志就是讲，伊讲咱即个政府的声音甲人民的声音无同款。伊想要去讲你安怎做一寡，咱当做啥物代志来解决即个问题。我小讲一下吼，咱以前若开始正式演讲的时候，我尽量要希望恁逐个看即本册吼，安尼我就免踮咧翻译伤要求的时间，拢详细另外然后就是讲到尾啊吼，伊若有 slide 先吼，我再咱甲介绍一下，甲翻译一下，上尾啊咱再有一个结论吼，多谢。
I usually speak very formally. I'll try to stick more to my normal speech today so you can keep up. We've already talked today about how the international pressure from China is causing a great threat to Taiwan's democracy. We have in Taiwan then today a government that is not listening to the people and is turning a deaf ear to the desire of the citizens. We have a media in Taiwan that is not interested in the truth, but rather in dogmatism, promotion of dogma and sensationalism. And we have a government that believes the best way to communicate is through the purchase of advertorials instead of having transparent information and interviews with the media. And we see a determination of too many people in power in the ruling government that want to distort or to hide or to obscure the truth of public opinion and the majority opinion in Taiwan. So when we have a democratically elected government like this, it's very dangerous to have one that uses its authority and its power to control the information and to misrepresent the views of the masses instead of representing the interests of the people. In this case, we have a democratically elected government that uses its power and its position to promote to the outside world a vision, an idea of Taiwan that is not in line with what the majority of people in Taiwan believe. And we know that this is the population that placed this government in power in the first place, but they're not listening. The government is not listening to the voters at the present time. Of course, we know Ma Ying-jeou's approval ratings are also in the 30% range. So there's some response to this, but it's not that strong. So today I'm going to talk in part about the notion of democratic representation. And I'm going to talk about three forms of representation, and I have these up here on the slides. I'll discuss how I read the majority voice in Taiwan and how that voice is being ignored or misrepresented. I want to discuss how that misrepresentation presents a threat to Taiwan's democracy, and also how it lays a very weak foundation for Taiwan's domestic and international policy. And finally, I want to talk about how the people of Taiwan can more strongly promote themselves domestically, how they can represent themselves domestically and internationally. So there's three forms of representation I'll talk about. One is the typical sort of political representation, where we have elected representatives in our government. So we elect people to represent our interests, to represent our views. The second form is to describe, to represent ourselves to others, to present ourselves and represent ourselves as defining ourselves having a particular character. And in this case, we're kind of talking about how the Taiwanese people present themselves to the rest of the world. And in this case, the problem I'll describe is what the Taiwanese people think and how they want to represent themselves is not the way the current government is representing them. Right? We're having a difference of opinion. And finally, we have the third, which I'll talk about toward the end. And to represent means to serve as an example of an ideal type, the best, to be a representative of the strongest, of the best. And Taiwan, as I'll talk about, has that potential. And I think by talking about that, we can talk about how Taiwan can strengthen itself in the future. So, back in 1982, I studied in Taiwan for the first time. I was young, I had a lot of hair, I wasn't so fat, and I was young and energetic and idealistic. I was, I was here during the time, of course, when we were still under martial law. The martial law in 1982 was not as harsh as it had been in earlier years, but clearly the signs of control were present. We still had political prisoners, of course. We had the telltale signs of control, limited TV channels, limited media coverage, and the heavy dose of government propaganda talking about what Taiwan is, promoting the idea of Chinese identity, denigration of all things Taiwanese, and the ongoing promise of unification under the glorious Kuomintang, that the time was coming, that the Kuomintang was going to lead us all back to a glorious day of unification. It puzzled me, even as a young college student, as I studied in Taiwan and got to know Taiwan better, why such an advanced society with such high levels of education, so economically advanced, was still under martial law. Why did the people in Taiwan not have the opportunity to live in democracy? And when I returned to the United States as my senior paper in college, I wrote a paper entitled, I still have it, A Time for Change. And this was my manifesto, I guess, of those years. My call to the Taiwanese people, to the Taiwanese Kuomintang government, to say it is foolish and it is inappropriate for the Kuomintang to perpetuate martial law. And it's time for Taiwan to become democratic. I believe that democracy was appropriate for Taiwan because it would create a better government and better human rights within Taiwan, but I also believed it would help Taiwan in representing itself, in promoting its interests, in developing international legitimacy. And so, how did this turn out? Of course, we have seen democracy as it was fought for and as it emerged improve the lives of the people in Taiwan. Democracy has improved life here. But the improvement is fragile, and it depends on an ongoing commitment to defending and promoting democracy and to improving the process of representation, to make sure those elected officials are representing your interests. Unfortunately and significantly, democratization in Taiwan has not done as much for Taiwan's position in the international community. The whole process of globalization has been disappointing in the extent to which it's promoted democracy and human rights. There's been much more interest in economic power, not in democracy and human rights. Part of course, Taiwan's problem is resistance from China, but part of the problem, of course, comes from within Taiwan, and this is what B. Kim was talking about earlier today. We know that there is a dramatic increase in Taiwan identity. We know that there is a decrease in desire for unification with China, and yet we have a government now that is increasingly talking about Chinese identity and increasingly talking about unification, as if the voices of the people do not matter here at all. So well, I'm not going to talk then. I'm going to talk about this concept of representation and identity. I'm not going to talk a lot about history today. We know most of the people in this room lived the history, know the history much better than I do. And it is true that to know where you are, you have to know where you've been. And Taiwan's collective memory and collective identity is tied to the history of Ba and the White Terror. But because you're so familiar with this, you know this well, I'm not going to talk about it a lot. Instead, I'm going to spend my time talking about where we are today. To know where we're going, we must know where we are today. And I'm going to spend more time on talking about where I think Taiwan is today and where I think it's going in the future. So we'll look at the concept of 人统政治 that we hear all the time. And it's impossible to talk about Taiwan's domestic politics without discussing identity, unfortunately. Both in Taiwan and outside of Taiwan, commentators, observers, scholars who look at Taiwan's politics focus on identity when discussing elections or any other political event. We know there's an emphasis on ethnic identity as well as national identity. We know there are numerous polls that ask the question, are you Taiwanese, are you Chinese, or are you both? Do you favor unification, independence, or the status quo? Do you speak Taiwanese or Chinese? Where are your parents from? What's your favorite food? All these kind of questions. Identity plays an important role in Taiwan's politics. It's not the only factor we'll talk about, but it plays an important role. But what is the problem with identity politics? Part of the big problem is that the identity issue is not presented accurately here. The identity issue is often presented in a manner that makes it sound like the society is evenly divided. And in fact, we say, right? We say that this is sort of a 50-50 deal. And if we look at it, this idea of this, so we say, chit wa tong, right? Is that right? I know a little. Anyway, so this is the way it's presented. And this is a very inaccurate presentation of the information, as I'll show in the data. From all the data I've seen, all the data you've seen, we know that in fact that the identity is not 50-50, that it's Taiwanese and becoming more strongly Taiwanese, that it is increasingly pro-independence, and yet this is not the way it's presented. I had the opportunity to do a survey of my own last year when I was here, and I did a survey of 941 college students at 14 different universities with the help of some of my good friends, and some of whom are here today, Jerome. And so I'll talk about some of the responses from the college students today that help us understand where we think identity is. I know from my surveys that the young people today are very Taiwanese. Now, they may not speak Taiwanese fluently. They may not wear t-shirts that say, I am Taiwanese, but they are Taiwanese. And I'll show some of the data to confirm this. As you'll see the data, we have to ask the question, if the indicators are so strong, there's such a strong Taiwanese identity and such a strong desire for independence, what's the problem? And the problem, as I pointed to already, in part, is this misrepresentation of history, misrepresentation of identity that's coming from, to a great extent, the Kuomintang government. Part of the confusion over identity in Taiwan is planted deeply in the roots of the 40 years of martial law, the authoritarian rule of the Kuomintang. This is a period when the Kuomintang promoted aggressive and often violent policies to force the people of Taiwan to accept Chinese identity. And because the Kuomintang not only controlled domestic information, but information going out to the international community, it also promoted simultaneously this notion that the people in Taiwan believed they were Chinese. Promoted the idea that the desire of the people of Taiwan was to unify with China. And so globally we see this influence that came from the Kuomintang that created a confusion in the international community about what the people of Taiwan really want.